Welcome back to Yes Europe Malta. This is Kelma B'Kelma episode 3. Thank you for everyone for all of the attention that you've been giving us for the first couple of episodes. Today we're joined by Timothy Alden. Tim is the project manager for sustainability projects at the Malta Business Bureau. His main area of focus is promotion of a greener economy. One of his focuses is energy and water efficiency, which he engages with through EU-funded projects such as LIFE EnergyEfficiency4SMEs. Tim is also involved in upskilling, such as a project on environmental, social and governance training to transition businesses to more sustainable practices. He has quite a deep portfolio. We're very privileged to have him on for an interview today. And we're actually having this interview in his flat. So thank you for inviting me and thank you for coming on for an interview. We really appreciate it. Perfect. So Tim, I'm going to go straight in with like a really kind of a deep question, which feel free to elaborate
Hit me
on.
with it.
So how could any government, and maybe you can use a local example as well, go about leading the country into making a transition to a sustainable energy system and create an economically self-sustaining energy sector as well?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. The idea of a self-sustaining energy system is thrown around a lot because it sounds attractive.
Yes.
But people don't realize what the obstacles are. The idea of generating all of our energy in Malta. Obviously, when we say that, we're looking at green energy. In my time in the Malta Chamber of Commerce, where I worked as a policy executive, we had committees set up composed of leading businessmen from their respective fields, and one of them was the Energy Committee, Energy Efficiency Committee. And one of the problems which immediately came up as we were deciding, trying to discuss how we can make this happen, is the fact that we've got a very high population density.
Sure.
So fine, we have a lot of sunlight and we tend to think, okay, solar is an obvious solution. But think of a 5-story block of flats, all the people living in the energy intensity. So for that same roof footprint, you suddenly have to deal with all the energy needs of that quantity of people.
For sure.
So even though over the past few decades Malta has been seriously scaling up its PVs, the population has also kept growing. So the demand for energy has kept growing, and therefore we've remained, at the same level, around 12% of energy generation through renewables.
So obviously those are circumstances that are really prevalent over here. So then when you come about to developing a strategy, so what strategies do you believe are necessary for Malta to reduce its reliance on important energy sources and increase its energy security as a result?
Yes. One thing that we were discussing before the government brought it into the mainstream conversation was the idea of floating offshore wind.
Yeah.
Because we've got obviously such an abundant resource in terms of our water, our seas. But the problem with that is the cost. So for the same price of a few floating turbines, you can get so much more PVs installed. And there are still places where you can install quite a few PVs, mostly the industrial estates, so on top of factories, etc., etc. And the forecast is that floating offshore wind will become more economically feasible in about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now the government has taken this into consideration, so they're trying to come up with a roadmap to roll this out. We were suggesting that we should start off with a few pilot projects in Malta, get the legislation aligned, so when it becomes really affordable, we'll be in a really strong position to hit the ground running and roll it out. Aside from that though, I don't think we're making enough use of certain PV technology which you can put on the sides of buildings, on the sides of factories. People tend to be quite stuck in their ways and not realize what different products and options are out there. And they're obviously more expensive. So it's a question of economies of scale. And as these are adopted more in other parts of the world and in Europe, it will become cheaper for us to do that.
Are you familiar with degrowth?
Yes.
Okay, so we've talked about this in the last couple of episodes as well, and just in the episode we filmed with Tiago Vicente in episode 2, and we were talking about how there's always going to be a demand for energy, right? So we're a growing population, resource management becomes really critical. That's not always going to be something that we can rely on to be very efficient in when we try to scale down our resource usage, but energy demand is always going to be there. So if fossil fuels account for a large portion of our energy supply, and we go, okay, fine, let's invest into more research, innovation, and then implementation of alternative energies, we're not actually solving the problem, because we're just adding more energy. So we're going from 100% energy supply to now 125%. And what that means is you're just now giving more of a luxury to people who can then pick and choose what energy they want. So then degrowth becomes really popular, becomes really kind of necessary within that certain circumstances. So do you think if Malta was to move towards research and innovation for that, do you think that the infrastructure would have to change, would have to have an overall change, or can we do things in brick by brick?
That's a fantastic question. This actually came up in a conference recently, and I said that degrowth tends to scare people. And the host took me out of context to say, yes, that's why we can't have it, but that's not what I meant. It's there are some parallel issues which I think if we discuss those, it opens the door to that conversation. So first of all, there's the concept of energy efficiency. Now in the EU, this is discussed in the following way. Before you should be thinking of renewables, you should first be thinking about energy efficiency, because it follows that same principle. It recognizes that you can keep increasing your energy generation, but if the demand keeps going up, you're still going to have ultimately a strain on resources and capacity. The whole point of energy efficiency is to do more with less. And that's why there's a new strategy in the EU that buildings have to be a certain amount of, have to reach a certain level of efficiency, or you won't even be able to sell them or put them on the market in about 5, 6, 7 years. So that's going to be a huge problem for Malta, and there's going to be a spike in prices because people are going to have to renovate their houses just to reach that. Now, to address the other side of the coin, there is already a growing consensus in Malta that we have to move away from quantity and move towards quality.
Yes.
Now, that stretches to tourism, it stretches to everything, the quality of construction, and the underlying point is quality of life. You don't want to just, because the whole point of degrowth is that you know that you cannot grow forever because the planet's resources are finite.
Yes.
And within that context, you have to, that's the whole point of sustainability, to have an ongoing resource. So, I think degrowth gets an unnecessarily bad rep, and people don't give the time of day to understand what it's really about. So I'm very interested in it.
Absolutely, and I think it's definitely a conversation that we need to be having right now as we sort of transition. We're already in the transition. Maybe it's not going as quickly as we wanted to, but we have to already begin exploring everything in a very holistic way if we want it to be a future that we can feel secure about. You brought up pricing. Peak time versus off-peak time energy pricing difference is a fairly well explored concept and practice, and this is to encourage like a better distribution of energy consumption throughout the day and potentially a lower price for consumers requiring less renewable energy generation at a point in time. So could such a discrete policy be theoretically successful in a country like Malta?
Theoretically, it sounds good to me.
Yep.
My practice with it is a discussion in the business context. So the manufacturing sector has been pushing for a number of years for a night tariff.
Yes, exactly.
Which would allow, obviously, pressure to be taken off the grid and cheaper electricity to be sold to the companies if they operate certain processes at night. The main barrier to the implementation of that is possibly that this is just for the business community. It would be a different story for residential. But there are so many differences between the manufacturing companies in Malta, and we're so small that it's difficult to accommodate everyone. Some companies can't run a night shift, or they're not big enough to justify running a night shift. So then the concern is that you would have a night tariff for only about 10 companies, and then it becomes, a tailor-made policy where you're just giving a handout rather than solving a problem. I still believe in night tariffs, because then if you have them, you will encourage businesses to change their practice. So I do think it's something we should be aiming towards.
For sure, I agree. So debates rage on about whether Malta should invest in multiple interconnectors from Sicily, invest in more electric vehicles, more solar or photovoltaic panels, and other potential renewable systems, right? Fundamentally, could it be possible for Malta to have energy security over supply that is subject to irregular price fluctuations as a result?
Well, this comes back to the first question: can we have complete energy independence? No,
No.
we're always going to depend on the interconnector.
Yes.
However, what we can do with the interconnector is aim to buy green energy. So that should be the long-term goal: to buy green energy to justify the electrification of our economy, so that we remove fossil fuels from any part of the equation.
Okay, so furthermore, are financial incentives the way forward without sort of shocking the energy market? Can a free market be the guiding hand for energy transition?
So, speaking strictly about incentives, in the conference I mentioned earlier, Grant Thornton raised a good point, which is that if you have an incentive with a certain limited budget, it will run out without necessarily changing behavior in quite a short time. But if you link it to perhaps more advanced financial mechanisms like zero interest loans, you can stretch the money out much more and therefore encourage a bigger change in behavior. However, I think it really depends on the incentive.
Okay.
So let's look at Iras Taura Darek, because it's just come out, which encourages the renovation of buildings. It has helped to shift the market towards increasing the amount of workers who specialize in restoration of houses, etc. It has increased the demand, but that money is gone within 10 minutes of the grant opening. So I think it's a case of you're either gonna go big or go home. So it depends on the design of the incentive, depends on the particular scheme.
For sure. Okay, so this isn't a question that I've written down, but I'm
Yes,
just
that's
really
fine.
curious to get your thoughts about it. Green hydrogen.
Yes.
So about a month ago, I wish I remember the details of the event, but it's just popped into my head. I think there was a conference at the Hilton, which is just literally a couple of minutes in that direction. The Ministry of Energy attended, and a Serbian physicist or Serbian engineer, I'll put the link to the article in the description. He was talking about how the price of hydrogen will be about $3 per kilo in 2030, and that Malta should invest in the potential for green hydrogen becoming a really important part, like economically, for the country. Obviously, hydrogen is a really important chemical, not just as in, within its context within energy, but also hydrogen is used extensively for the manufacture of so many different things within industry. And if you can manufacture hydrogen to the steam reforming of methane and using renewable sources, that's what we call green hydrogen. So what are your thoughts about potentially that becoming a serious economic activity in Malta?
Yes, I'm very interested in that. This was discussed again in our energy committee. The concern with it was that, let's say we've got the hydrogen-ready pipeline finished between Malta and Sicily. The process of transferring it to Malta and then working it to make it usable here would be quite intensive. So the form would change between Sicily and Malta, and therefore there would be a lot of waste of energy just getting it to Malta.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think more studies need to be done, but it should definitely be a long-term goal.
Last question. So the government has recently been calling for contractors to become more sustainable when engaging in development without adding additional costs onto buyers. Sellers can therefore opt to increase property prices and state that the increase is due to location, material, inflations and other factors. So what are your views on this potential conundrum for prospective first-time buyers?
Yes, this is always the excuse used not to take any meaningful action to reform the industry, that it will affect first-time buyers. However, it is just an excuse, because does it mean that we can never do anything? First of all, no. But second of all, if you actually do enact these reforms, yes, initially it is going to be more expensive, but then as it becomes a standard and everyone has to do it, then you have the demand, which should bring down the price again.
Absolutely,
people would adapt their practices. So it's really a question of how we do it. And then obviously, if people can't afford these properties, then the prices will have to come down as a response.
Absolutely.
So then in terms of the actual mechanism to make sure that that initial spike of price is not too impactful, then you might see what incentives are possible. However, let's keep in mind that the government is already heavily subsidizing the industry in several forms.
Sure.
So you have to go back and look at the overall economic model. If we keep on pursuing this model where we knock down our heritage homes and damage the quality of life of residents to just fit as many people as possible to exploit in them, then you're not solving the underlying problem.
No, you're not.
You need to fix the economic model. And that takes us back to the idea of moving to quality, which might not be the best word. So if we're going to talk about quality, let's talk about quality of life.
Absolutely, it's about raising the standard, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's about well-being.
Welfare, yeah. So Malta is the most densely populated country in Europe, whose population is above 100,000 people, right? And a growing global population requires careful resource management. One of those resources is space, but people need places to live and work. And do you think Malta is doing enough to implement an effective construction environmental management plan to facilitate how activities undertaken during the construction phase of development will be managed to mitigate environmental circumstances? Do you think such measures were put in place in the past?
Now that's actually the subject more or less of my dissertation due on the 5th of June.
So there is context for me asking that question.
yes. Well, the answer of course is mostly no.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the main incentive behind the way our policies have been designed has always been economic speculation, to give a kickstart to the economy. By increasing the heights over a certain area, you're automatically condemning, ultimately, at least the way the policies are interpreted now, condemning that site to destruction. The planning authority is supposed to interpret sites according to their context. So there was a recent court ruling in Santa Lucia where you had rows of 2 floors, houses that were 2 floors, and someone wanted to build up high, which would not only have ruined the context of the street, but created an excuse to develop the rest of them. The Court of Appeal struck that down, which sets a precedent that this can be hopefully copied elsewhere, even though it's not binding. The residents who objected to that actually wrote in their objection, we know we could profit from this, but we'd rather maintain our quality of life. In terms of a plan, government right now is revising SPED, but it seems to be quite sensitive, because when I've asked about it, people have panicked, so I don't know what's going on.
So maybe we won't go there then.
Well, it will come out for consultation eventually.
For sure, okay.
But here's the thing about the construction industry in Malta. It's a prisoner's dilemma type situation. So you've got the 2 main political parties who are bought out by several powerful businessmen. This is not only not a secret, it's not even controversial to state this. In my interviews with politicians, with institutions, with civil society, with members of the general public, this is an accepted fact. And even the politicians have come out and said it, and not only have the politicians come out and said this, you've got the Malta Developers Association saying this, which is why the Malta Developers Association wants party financing reform, because not even they, at least officially, like the idea that there won't be a level playing field and some people can just buy power directly.
So is multi-partisanship, do you think, an avenue that needs to be explored?
Well, when I was in politics, that was my driving motivation, to break the prisoner's dilemma with that formula. However, now there are a lot of people in institutions like the Chamber of Commerce trying to push policies to break that deadlock. And that's actually one of the reasons that I had moved to work with the Chamber of Commerce and now with the Malta Business Bureau. Because if you are an impartial voice, then it means both sides can listen to you. And the one most effective solution, aside from potentially a multi-party system, which actually was a recommendation in the Chamber of Commerce's Good Governance document, manifesto, which came out in 2020. It called for electoral reform. So again, that's nothing controversial to say. This was a policy position taken by the Chamber of Commerce. Aside from that, what you can have is both political parties realizing that it is in the common interest to come together and stop playing into the tragedy of the commons, to stop undermining each other and agree on the common difficult policy solutions. They need to reform the construction industry, because the main fear that the politicians have is that if they go against the businessmen who are chiefly responsible for a lot of the damaging projects, that they will lose the donations and therefore they will lose the election, because the parties are not self-sustaining financially. So therefore, to remove the fear that if one party goes against the developers, the other one will take advantage. Both of them need to come together and agree on the common solution.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we are trying to establish a trend to end every Kelma B'Kelma episode by talking about the role of young people and potentially environmental NGOs as well. So Tim, why is it paramount for youths in Malta to understand how and where and from their energy is being supplied from, and how can younger generations begin to engage in energy consumption and energy activism? So do you believe environmental NGOs have a role to play in that, or do you think young people should just learn as much as they can, begin discourse, and then maybe use that as a springboard for potentially getting involved in trying to make a change?
NGOs are fundamental. The only reason I'm here with you today is because I worked for an environmental NGO.
And so do I.
Yes, there you go. So the environmental NGO gave me my knowledge of policy. I wasn't even working in policy. I was working in events to do the fundraising for the organization, to sustain its activism efforts. It was Flimkien Al-Ambjent Aħjar, actually. So by working in that context and working in that environment, I picked up all the policy. I already had the principles, which is why I went and worked for them, but they gave me the education. And that became a springboard into my political activity. And obviously the political activity gave me the knowledge and experience to then join the Chamber of Commerce and now the Malta Business Bureau. So it's been, a trajectory.
A trajectory, yeah.
Yes. So, yes, and what the contribution of NGOs and young people, I was going to say, yes, that it's not just about reducing your energy usage, because that's what you mentioned. Mm-hmm. It's the role that countries like Malta can play on the international stage as well. Because something which happened in COVID, which was quite discouraging, was you saw the world grind to a standstill. And then you looked at, in spite of those massive changes and empty streets, the amount of carbon emissions only dropped by under 20% globally.
Yes. Yeah.
So you can imagine how that was actually very discouraging for me at first, because you realize that even if everyone pulls together and manages a massive behavioral change, you're still not doing enough, which shows that the economic model needs to change.
For sure. The global economy is hugely fossil fuel dependent.
Yes.
And it's not just developing countries. The world's largest economies are incredibly to meet the demand. To have that kind of holistic overhaul, it is quite literally an overhaul. It's almost like no one wants to change their bed sheets in the morning, but they have to do it, right? So it's one of those things that it needs that collective global community effort in order to get it done completely. And Malta may be a small country, but we're part of something much bigger. And if we can, be a society and be a country and potentially a government that can lead the change, and it is promising. The investment into research and innovation, the commitment and the pledge for it is really good in Malta. Malta gets pretty good, publicity for it, and there are many breakthroughs that have the potential to happen here. I think it is promising from a national scale, in my opinion.
You're absolutely right. Malta was a key player in making climate change one of the topics discussed at the United Nations. Mm-hmm. So we've got a legacy that we should live up to in that regard.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet us. Thank you to everyone who watched. You can find Timothy Alden, all his stuff downstairs. Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram, and obviously subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll be bringing more Kelma B'Kelma episodes in the future. In fact, I'm filming episode 4, I think in 3 days. So there's more coming your direction, and hopefully this isn't the last time that you see us and Timothy Alden collaborate together, because I've enjoyed the interview.
Yes, I've been inspired by it, and I look forward to working with you and helping you however I can.
For sure. Thank you so much to everyone, and have a good day.